Welcome, everyone, to the latest edition of the NatWest Markets U.S. Election Podcast Series. I'm John Briggs, Head of Strategy for the Americas.
And I'm Brian Dangerfield, Head of G10FX Strategy for the U.S.
It's been about a month since we last spoke, and man, what a month it's been. Virus expansion, protests, you name it. In our last podcast, we actually floated the idea that the election could be decided by the end of June. But before we conclude on that, the past month has also seen a big drop for Trump in the polls. He sure looks like he's in trouble. But Brian, didn't we hear the same thing in 2016?
Well, we certainly did, but I think there's important reasons why we should look at 2020 differently than we looked at 2016. And it's not as much about President Trump as it is regarding President Trump's opponent. So if you look back at 2016 versus 2020, Trump's national polling average, if you look at national polling averages by Real Clear Politics, is roughly the same, polling in the high 40% range nationally. The real difference is that he's polling worse against Biden than he did against Clinton in 2016 because Biden is polling better than Clinton did at the time. So, for example, if you look at the Real Clear Politics average right now, the president is down 9 points to Biden, and that's mostly a Biden story relative to Clinton in 2016. So against Clinton, he had not trailed by 9 points at any point after April of 2016. So for about 6 months prior to the election, he had not trailed by 9 points in a national average. That's where he is now. Biden is consistently polling better than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. And for the president, that's a challenge. That his low polling numbers are not something that's necessarily new. But what is new is that the former Vice President Joe Biden looks like a more formidable opponent. Now, there's a number of reasons behind why that might be. One of the ones that we have looked at recently is approval ratings or disliked unfavorability ratings for Clinton versus Biden. And Clinton herself was a candidate who was generally high in terms of dislike ratings. And we know from exit polling, one exit poll from CNN showed that voters who disapproved of both Trump and Clinton, which made up about 20% of the electorate, if you could believe that, that 20% of the electorate broke to Trump 47% to 20%. If you look at the same group of voters in 2020, a Monmouth poll released just last week showed that those same voters who disapprove of both Biden and Trump would break towards Biden 55% to 29%. So that's a pretty big swing. And Biden may have an advantage in that he is not as unpopular as Clinton was. And I think that shows up in the polling. And I think it shows up in the unfavorability ratings. And so President Trump's base is extremely solid. His base is roughly the same as it was in 2016. The difference in the polling averages I think we should watch is how Biden is progressing relative to Clinton, because, you know, it's easy to look back at 2016 and say we underestimated Trump. But when you look at it from the perspective that we're viewing it, it looks almost like instead we should be talking about how we may have been overestimating Hillary Clinton, and if we have that same view for Biden. And so the polling does tell you that Trump is behind, but there's a key difference here, and it's that the quality of the opponent, the strength of the opponent, looks like it's stronger in 2020 than it was in 2016.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be important to watch because, you know, in a way, it's still been all about Trump. We talked about this last time. Biden hasn't done much. He's not doing rallies. He's started to get out there a little bit. But, you know, as Biden gets more on the scene, it's going to be interesting to see if people start to, you know, disapprove of him a little bit more, or if, you know, that spread continues. The other thing that, you know, you and I have talked about and we've watched is this direction of the country poll. And, you know, right now, almost 68% of people polled feel like the direction of country is on the wrong track. The last time we had this was back in 2016. So, you know, that doesn't really bode well for Trump either. And it's seen a massive, massive collapse in a lot of that, really in the last couple of months since COVID struck out. But, you know, when we think about all of that, what you said, and that Trump's kind of behind, and, you know, we know his base is strong, extremely loyal. I mean, there was one article that I read recently that called it almost like Saddam Hussein like polling numbers amongst his base. But, obviously this is more realistic. But, I don't know if he can win without getting some votes outside the base. So I'm a little confused what the strategy is. I mean, we know that we've talked about this before. We know that his idea is to rally his base, have a very strong turnout there, and then try to, diminish or suppress turnout everywhere else, or try to, get those votes away from it everywhere else. So, the idea, though, is he's still going to need to bring over some of these independents. And that tends to be kind of an economy thing and the healthcare of COVID. But he's really focusing on a lot of the same things that he did back in 2016, a lot of race issues, some xenophobia type stuff, blaming China. I feel like the country's just in a different place than it was then. If you look at surveys on whether people think race is a problem in America, it's very, very different now. So I'm a little surprised about how he's not focusing a little bit more on the economy. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you mentioned that pulling in independent voters, sort of pulling in middle ground voters, is probably going to be key, or at very least getting those voters to not vote for Biden, to get them to vote for somebody else. In that sense, Trump may need Biden to make a mistake, but to the point of what can Trump do, I think it really is going to lean on the economy. And even before COVID, the place where President Trump was really pulling a lot of his support and expectations for him to win were quite high, I think, going into this year, was because the economy had been doing so well. And so as a result, it feels like the economy is something he's going to have to lean more heavily into. So COVID is a story that we talk a lot about, how Trump is a master at changing the narrative. COVID is a story that the narrative cannot be changed from. It is so universal and so wide-reaching that it's difficult to change that narrative. But in one way he can try and do that is by pushing the economy as far as he can. And that probably leads us into the possibility of more stimulus. So regardless of whether or not we get new stimulus, that debate is going to be heating up into the end of this month. Not only are there some expiring provisions from previous stimulus, but we know that the House and Senate go on recess for the month of August. So the will to get something done heading into that deadline in August is probably going to be picking up. And so if I'm the president, I'm looking at the economy as the way I can try and pull independents back into my camp. The economy recovering can help sort of cover some of the wounds from the COVID experience. Stimulus could be a way to get us there. And it seems likely that the president's going to try and embrace more stimulus. Now, one of the issues is that as the economy is showing signs of bottoming, certainly we've had some great data coming off from some depressed levels in recent weeks and months. One of the issues is that the president has a bit of a signaling problem where he wants to sell the U.S. as a recovering economy, a strong economy, one that's coming back under his leadership, but also one that needs historic stimulus. Might be a difficult sort of bridge to walk on. But it seems like if the way forward is the economy, he's going to have to push on the stimulus side. And we'll see if partisan bickering as we get closer to election can really stand in the way of that as we get towards the end of this month.
Yeah, I mean, just for our listeners, so we do expect there is going to be some additional stimulus, maybe even to the range of $750 billion to $1 trillion, of which 250, call it 300, might be aid to consumers. But as Brian noticed, the partisan bickering is already picking up. I mean, the Democrats want to extend unemployment benefits. The Republicans want to have like a bonus back to work type thing. Trump wants direct payments, and that's even just on that issue. So. Things like infrastructure spending, there are some things people would agree on, like broadband, but, on green energy, that kind of stuff, there's a lot of disagreements that are coming up. And Mnuchin himself seems to want to wait. So it's certainly not written in stone. I mean, the bipartisanship we saw earlier is at risk here. I do think they will get something done because in the end, the way we've gotten through these things is candy for everybody. You just spend on everything. So, that's why we lean towards it being a little bit larger than not overall. But there is a chance to come out of July and into the recess without any help, additional help for consumers at a time their unemployment benefits are rolling out, eviction notices might be coming out. So, a lot of things here that point towards a a risk when it comes to Trump and the economy, which, and I agree with you, that's kind of where I think he needs to lean into in order to try to get some of that independence. And he's still, the one place he's beating Biden is not, in the swing states. I mean, the swing states of North Carolina is the lowest margin right now using Real Killer Politics of +3. It goes all the way out to Michigan, where Biden's favored by 7. But within all of those, his stewardship of the economy, people still poll better. Trump still polls better amongst people for the stewardship of the economy. So, if he doesn't tack there, I'd be surprised. And I think that maybe, if we can get to the end of the month and the focus starts turning towards stimulus, he'll do that. So, I think the other thing we should mention is we're kind of getting down to the wire as far as Biden's running mate here, Brian. We know that he's committed to selecting a woman. There's certainly a lot of momentum within the party to pick an African-American woman. The betting markets have Kamala Harris as the overall favorite. Do you think that markets are going to worry about this pick, or, it's going to have a big impact?
So I don't think it's going to have a big impact on the market unless it's really someone like Elizabeth Warren. Remember, at the beginning of this process, markets were quite focused on whether or not you would get an establishment Democrat at the top of the ticket, which we got. Joe Biden is probably the hallmark of what we'd call the establishment Democrats, or you would get a progressive Democrat, most notably Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. So betting markets, as you mentioned, have Kamala Harris, the former California senator, current California senator, as the most likely choice. She and Susan Rice are the two top choices on betting markets. Both, I would say, are from what you'd call the establishment wing, and so unlikely to move markets. If you were to choose someone from the progressive wing, I think the markets might take some notice that if it were to be Elizabeth Warren, for example, that does pull the possible range of options for Democrats to the left in terms of how the party platform will evolve. So I think the markets might take a little bit of notice if Warren is the pick. Otherwise, I think we're going to be continuing to focus on the individuals at the top of the ticket, Trump and Biden.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the other thing that markets will start to take notice of is that if these current trends continue, or that we continue to see, the virus trends continuing, and the case outbreaks we've seen in swing states have been actually pretty remarkable in addition to the South. So I think that's a real risk. I mean, when we originally posed the idea that, the election could be decided by the end of June, what we were looking at was whether some of these outbreaks had continued to the point where, it started to hit him politically. I mean, you could make it so there's a lot of other things going on. I mean, the protests and all the other events that happened in June, it's hard to separate, but, all of the momentum is kind of combined in there with these cases rising. Even in Texas right now, it's still Republican lean, but a lot of the polls have moved a lot closer, right? And it's hard to say that can't have any virus impact on it. So, it might have been a little strong to say the election's determined by June, but I think some of the trends that started in June and we're starting to see accelerate in some areas into July could be, the turning point in the election. And that by fall, the bigger debate might be whether the Democrats are going to sweep all houses of Congress, both chambers of Congress, in addition to Biden taking the presidency. But we'll leave that as a cliffhanger for next time, because I do think the next couple of weeks are going to be critical towards determining what not just the presidency, but the overall makeup, about whether we can get these virus trends in control, and also whether fatality rates stay low or not. You're getting into that time right now where the lags should start to indicate, obviously, hopefully not. Hopefully we're not going to see those lags kick in, but we're starting to get in the next couple of weeks is where we're going to be able to determine that or not. So on one hand, if we've learned to live with the virus and fatalities remain low, then Trump could probably come back from these outbreaks, especially if he focuses on the economy. If not, then it's going to be a very, very big uphill battle. Like I said, we'll talk a little bit about that more next time. And I want to thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks very much for listening.